Great. So, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. And welcome and thank you for being here. My name is Machiko Walcott. I will be the host, the presenter, and the moderator for the session. So, for those of you who don't know me, just a little bit of introduction. I've been in the data and analytics consulting and delivery business for over 25 years, and having run a kind of a large multinational analytics consulting practice. And so I currently work as a strategic and management consultant, doing kind of advisory on the non-technical aspects of data and analytics. So basically, I cover everything outside of doing analytics, things that make data and analytics more successful and perhaps less painful for everybody. By the way, I use the term analytics rather broadly for convenience, so that to include statistics, data science, AI, machine learning, BI, and other related fields and branches. So none of this is really specific to a particular type of applied data analysis, if you will. Now, this talk is addressed primarily to the practitioners of analytics, but there's no technical content. So even if you're not a technical person, it should give you a good foundation for understanding what your analytics practitioners should be thinking about. So before we start, we have some housekeeping items. First, this session is being recorded, and so by staying in the meeting, you consent to be part of the recording. Otherwise, please feel free to leave and wait for the recording. Everybody who registered will receive a link to the recording as well as a copy of the slide deck. Now, since I will be running a one-person show, I apologize in advance for any glitches and mishaps. So in considerations for the other attendees, as well as to make the session a little bit more manageable for me, your cooperation in keeping your video and mic off is very much appreciated. If you have any questions, please enter them in the chat window, which apparently I have now enabled, and I will try to do my best to address them at the end. So, with great power comes great responsibility, right? Who said it? Well, maybe the first that comes to mind for pretty much everybody is Uncle Ben from Spider-Man, right? Voltaire, in an essay back in the 1700s, spoke of the ethical duties that came with positions of authority. The French National Convention during the Revolution said, you must consider that great responsibility follows inseparably from great power. Winston Churchill, during World War II, spoke of the burdens of leadership and its responsibilities. It's even in the Bible, right? So now, we statisticians and data scientists can do so much with data, and so much has been entrusted with us. Ethics is one of those topics that we may not hear about or talk about or even think about sometimes. It's a complex topic, and there's no definitive answer oftentimes. So today is Global Ethics Day, which was established by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs back in 2014. And as a certified management consultant, I'm held to standards of ethical practice to maintain the certification. And I currently have the pleasure of serving on the American Statistical Association's Committee on Professional Ethics. I am not an ethics expert by any stretch of imagination, but rather a champion of ethics. I've seen how ethics play out from the trenches in data and analytics. So today, my goal is to simply open up the conversation and raise awareness of these issues so that we are thinking about ethics in our daily professional lives. So there are several well-known cases of ethics in data and analytics, some of which you may be familiar with. The Cambridge Analytica case, right? It's probably one of the most recognized cases of the past decade. So they collected data from millions of Facebook users without consent and used the data to target political messages. So for the Facebook users, this was a matter of privacy and electoral manipulation. There's this case of My City Chatbot by the City of New York. So they launched the chatbot to help its citizens. Good intentions, right? But it ended up providing not just incorrect advice, but also some illegal advice. Then later they said that the chatbot was still in pilot phase. Amazon had an algorithm for evaluating candidates. This in itself seems reasonable, right? That's kind of what we do. But that particular algorithm turned out to be biased against women, largely because the training data was from the era of the previous biased hiring practices. There's a case of Clearview AI. So they created an image database to be used for facial recognition from data accessible on the internet. But is this unauthorized surveillance? So the case ended up in legal action and under regulatory scrutiny in several countries, and a few of which are, I think, still ongoing. Now, Apple AirTags is an interesting case. Most people want to use them to track their belongings. I put one in my checked luggage, right? Some people use them to track their dogs. But in reality, there are people who use them to stalk other people. Right? The problem is purely about the use of the solution in ways that were not originally intended. So it has raised a question about the ethical responsibility of anticipating and preventing misuse of an information product. And finally, the case of Target's predictive model from a couple of decades ago. So this is an oldie but a goodie. It started as a very standard marketing problem. They wanted to identify their pregnant customers and send them pregnancy-specific offers, coupons, right? So they analyzed their shopping patterns and ended up with a reasonably predictive model. So one day, suddenly, a father discovered that his daughter was pregnant because she started receiving pregnancy-related coupons in the mail. Now imagine that, right? So the algorithm ended up inferring something very private that seemed like a good and reasonable idea at that time. Now, it should be noted that in most of these cases, the problem wasn't really the legality, at least at that time, right? Now, of course, these cases involve large corporations, but ethical challenges and mishaps occur in our daily professional lives. The concepts of responsible AI and responsible data are very closely related. So obviously, right? I asked Microsoft Copilot for a quick description of each of these, and it tells me that responsible AI refers to the practice of designing, developing, and deploying artificial intelligence systems in ways that are ethical, transparent, fair, and aligned with human values and societal well-being. Excuse me, and responsible data as the ethical and secure handling of data to ensure privacy, fairness, transparency, and accountability throughout its life cycle. Now, these seem reasonable, right? Who would not want to do that? So, breaking this down a little bit. The first and perhaps the most talked about is the right to privacy these days. Regulations already exist with many more to come. And the regulatory world is super, super fluid. And it's complicated because each jurisdiction has its own version that requires specific implementation. Now, that said, they typically have ideas in common. And an important point is the distinction between custodianship and ownership when it comes to data. So specifically, the idea that the data belongs to the entity or the person about whom the information is, not necessarily to the entity that originated or has custody of the information. Privacy is an ethical obligation, but not the only ethical obligation, right? The idea of informed consent has been around for a long time, especially in scientific research. Now, informed consent has two parts, kind of obvious, but my right to be informed about what you're going to do with my data and my right to consent to what you're going to do with my data. Objectivity and fairness, or impartiality and absence of bias, if you want to put it that way, right? We hear a lot about bias, particularly in the context of discrimination, whether based on gender, age, race, etc., as in the case of Amazon, right? These biases can come from various sources, including the data, the sampling, the algorithm, the developer of the algorithm, and even the end user of the algorithm. Another hot topic is explainable AI, in air quotes. In practice, this really only refers to the interpretability of the product, which arose from the demand for transparency. Accountability, which is a key component in gaining trust. This is partially addressed through data and AI governance, but their implementations are not always very good and actually often quite poor. And finally, there are several questions about who owns the intellectual property. We'll get to this in a little bit. Okay, so what is the status of implementing these ethical concepts in data and analytics? Well, first, there are regulations. The European Union's GDPR, or General Data Protection Regulation, was probably the first major data regulation with multinational impacts. Um, since then, a lot of countries have followed suit, and they are still evolving. Now, most regulations focus primarily on data privacy, or tend to, anyways, and some do address certain aspects of algorithms, and there are several algorithm bills. Here, though, the speed of advancement in data analytics and AI presents a huge challenge because the regulations always lag behind any technology, and this lag is growing greater over time. Then there are research ethics reviews. So these are, generally required to conduct a scientific research that involve human subjects. The IRB review in the US and Canada is an example. They evaluate various types of risks like privacy, physical, psychological risks, emotional harm, risks of harm to vulnerable populations, and the details of informed consent. Excuse me. Interestingly, I personally am not aware of a true equivalent in the business world. This doesn't really mean that they don't exist, but at the end of the day, they are not at the forefront of the discussion. Then there are industry standards and frameworks, right? Some of the most notables will include things like the Privacy by Design framework. So this is the global privacy framework for technology and is now being incorporated into ISO standards. The US National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, has a framework for AI risk management, which includes the topic of ethical and responsible use. The European Commission has ethical guidelines for trustworthy AI. The ISO IEC 42001 standard for responsible, secure, and transparent AI management systems. And IEEE 7000 addresses various aspects of AI ethics like transparency and accountability. There are voluntary certifications. The International Association of Privacy Professionals has a certification program. There are ISO certifications, and there are several other organizations that certify individuals, products, systems, etc. Then there are professional guidelines and codes of ethics specific to data and analytics. So these are typically done by professional associations. For example, the American Statistical Association and the Association for Computing Machinery. The ASA guidelines will be going through a revision in 2026, and I'm excited to be a part of that. Now, in general, these codes and guidelines include certain elements like respect all stakeholders, not just data subject, but also clients, colleagues, collaborators, users, and even the general public and our social responsibilities, right? An interesting point is the emphasis on professional competency as an ethical obligation. Another is a respect for profession, which includes the obligation to protect the integrity of methods and techniques. There is an obligation to take responsibility as a professional. There are obligations and responsibilities to comply with the code or the guideline. And principles like, do no harm, honesty and transparency, fairness, privacy, and confidentiality are just common in many of these codes. Then there are organizational policies and practices. And so many organizations have policies and practices, but not all have them for data and analytics. When they do exist, they tend to be primarily for data governance and AI governance. And sometimes there's model governance that can address some aspects of ethics. There are rules and guidelines baked into employee policies about data, sometimes. They are specific practices observed by areas within the organization, sometimes. Then there are working groups, conferences, and various other initiatives that we may hear about, we may participate in, etc. So, what makes ethics so difficult? If it were easy, everybody would be doing it, right? There would be no ethical problems. But the reality is that there are many ethical challenges in the world. Now, some are both legal and ethical. For example, murder is wrong both ethically and legally, but it's not always that clear. Just because something is legal doesn't mean it's also ethical, and vice versa. This means that legal compliance does not guarantee ethical behavior, and vice versa. Ethical dilemmas occur often because there are conflicting value systems among the stakeholders. So, ethics and morals are closely related as both have to do with right and wrong, right? But in general, morals are kind of at the level of a specific individual or groups of individuals, while ethics is really more of a systematic view of everything. And so, this implies that what is moral for us may be immoral for others, hence the ethical dilemma, right? One of the characteristics of an ethical dilemma is that it is acceptable or even desirable to some, but not acceptable to others, according to their own value systems, right? And because there are different value systems, good ethical decision making requires identifying and understanding the different value systems. For that reason, ethical questions are not always black and white. They are often, not clear, and they can be quite confusing and put us in deeply gray areas. Ethical questions require a lot of care and critical thinking. They are often not very obvious. They may not even occur to us as ethical dilemmas. So, what are the ethical challenges for us, statisticians and data scientists? So, first, we need to recognize that it is our own behavior and decisions that matter, not what happens to us. Now, this is different from, for example, data security, where we have an obligation to prevent others from doing something to us. But with ethics, we are 100% in control of how we fulfill our ethical obligations. So, first, and the most general question is, can I versus should I? You can do something, but should you? Each of us is responsible for this decision. And while it is important to know when to do something, it's equally important to understand when not to do something. We often talk about ethics in really super general terms, but for those of us in data, there are really four distinct aspects. The purpose of the solution or the analysis, the data, whether it be for the development or for the operation of the solution, the algorithm or the model, and the use of the solution or the analytic, right? Each aspect has its own ethical considerations. Fairness and bias. Now, first, there are global or social biases in the world, right? Then we have our own personal biases. We can try to eliminate biases, but theory and reality are almost never the same. So, almost 2 decades ago, there was a time where I had to prove that a specific mortgage scoring model did not discriminate against protected classes. Simply avoiding certain variables is not adequate because other variables are kind of latently correlated with characteristics of the protected classes. So that's one example of going beyond simply, okay, this is not a checklist type thing. Um, We can eliminate one type of bias only to introduce another type of bias, right? Some biases are obvious, then there are hidden biases that we're not even aware of. And these biases exist in data and algorithms and developers and in users. Then it's important to recognize that, AI kind of learns from humans, right? In fact, a couple of years ago, there was a case of an AI algorithm that was designed and developed specifically to produce the most ethical responses to any ethical dilemma. And ironically, it ended up being racist and homophobic because it learned from humans. Intentionality and justification it's an interesting, a good one. Do you understand what you're doing? How do you demonstrate that you understand what you're doing? As an example, AI models can unintentionally expose personal data, which may be in the training data or in the data processed when using the model. What do you do to prevent this from happening? It's important to be aware of the consequences. Those who know me well have heard me say this 1,000 times. 99% of the unexpecteds are really should have been expected but not thought of. So we often do things that just kind of turn out to have consequences that we didn't expect, like I didn't know. But from the professional perspective, I didn't know may be unethical. I am not saying that we can never slip up because we're all humans, but our default position should be to know. And how do we build trust among all of our stakeholders? Now, this includes everybody from the data subject to the end users. How do we demonstrate our commitment to ethics? So then there's just a lot to consider in each of the four aspects. So, about the objective, should we develop it? Now, remember the pregnancy case, right? What harm could possibly result from this? Is it fair? Is it transparent? Where do you draw the line between effective customer targeting and giving everybody a fair chance? Where do you draw the line between experimentation and manipulation? What do A/B tests involve, for example? Very common in marketing, right? What are the intended uses? What are the unintended uses? What is the scope of its impact? For example, in an automated mass decision making, the scope and impact can be much greater just purely because of the volume and speed. Data. We think a lot about the development data because it affects us directly as developers. But our ethical obligations include consideration of the data that the algorithm is going to consume in its use. Sometimes this data comes from the users themselves. Now, first, anonymization and encryption are not enough. They are necessary but insufficient, as we say, right? Almost everything is identifiable today by triangulating various sources. So for that reason, all data at individual level really should be treated as if they were identifiable. There are regulations that already kind of point to this, GDPR being perhaps the best known. Use data only for the defined purposes. Now, this relates to the idea of informed consent, right? Does the subject or owner of the data know what you're using the data for? Do we have permission to use the data for the purpose at hand? And the idea is not limited to human subjects. Now, related to this is the idea of data minimization. How much data do we really need? This applies to both volume and types of information or variables. Avoid duplicating data. Purge data that is no longer needed, right? We love data. We're statisticians and data scientists. We love data. We want to hoard all data indefinitely, but is it ethical to put subjects at greater risk? There are inherent biases in almost all modern data sources. I'd say modern. They are what statisticians, we statisticians call observational data, data that have been generated without being deliberately and specifically designed for the purpose of the analysis at hand. Some call them administrative data, but they're all the same thing that exists first, and then we do something with it, right? So we need to understand that all modern data, so to speak, simply captures our thoughts, behaviors, and patterns. It has captured our history as is. If you use past hiring data, when practices were less equitable, you need countermeasures. If there's a case of healthcare algorithm that was biased against certain classes of patients who historically had less access to healthcare. Chatbots can give offensive responses. Now look, right? The world is full of people who think they know everything. That is reflected in the data. I mean, look at Facebook, look at X, right? Everybody is an expert. Data reflects that. Intellectual property can be embedded in data. Now, whose idea is it? Whose information is it? This applies to the development data as well as to the data processed by the use of the solution and even the data output, right, by the use of the solution. Algorithms. Now, this includes the technique used as well as the architecture and the structure of the model itself. So in selecting techniques and methods, right, how do you balance performance and transparency? Now, traditional statistical techniques are perhaps a little bit easier to understand as they tend to be a little bit more transparent. Machine learning techniques are generally less so, less transparent. And so then this can kind of lead us to well, the machine told me so, right? But that is not an ethical answer. Why do you choose to use the method or technique at hand? Consideration of the model architecture. Now, this does not, it's not technological architecture, but the architecture and the structure of the model itself. So that includes the selection of the variables, the how and the why of segmentation, types of treatments we apply to data, variables, other rules we create on data, among others. What are you doing in the development to reduce the cost of misinformation? In the case of my city, one of the costs was really leading people to break the law, right? Is that acceptable? Um, how are we building equity and eliminating bias? As I mentioned, avoiding certain variables is not enough. It's also important not to build our own biases into the solution. This happens a lot more often than we think, and it's a lot harder to avoid that than it sounds. Now, the use of the solution is somewhat related to the objectives. The more obvious question is, well, what are the unintended consequences of intended use? So there's risk of misinformation, right? This is the traditional risk of misclassification, as well as the risk of hallucinations, right? A hallucination can be something completely invented, or it can be something just completely wrong, right? Misinformation has costs. So what are the costs of false positives or false negatives? Are the benefits of the model worth these costs? Not only financial, but also reputational, legal, moral, physical, psychological, time, etc. Those are all costs. What if people use it as intended, but do so naively, for example, without understanding the solution, what the solution does? There's an example where some time ago, a lawyer used Gen AI without understanding that it could invent court cases and actually kind of got slapped for it. Now, what if people use it in ways that were not intended? Right? Now, there's a few, three different cases or three different scenarios. The use may be ignorant. They have good intentions, but having good intentions does not make you free from consequences. Second scenario, the use may be manipulative, perhaps not with a direct intention of causing harm, but this can include things like political manipulation or manipulation of markets in more subtle ways. And then finally, the use may be malicious with the intent to cause harm, right? Fraudulent, nefarious, or illicit uses. All of these could be results from the using things in ways that the solutions in ways that were not intended. Okay. Um, can the use of the solution perpetuate or worsen bias or other negative effects? Intellectual property, I mentioned earlier, the output of Gen AI algorithm does not always belong to the user, right? So how do we give proper credit and to whom? If I use ChatGPT to develop a report or an article, who owns the ideas obtained and how do I credit them? So this is kind of an ongoing debate. So putting all this into practice means taking the time and the effort to do the right thing. So to start, we can always keep the general principles in mind. Avoid harm, be fair, be honest and transparent, take responsibility, and respect and protect others, right? We have an obligation to be deliberate and intentional in every detail of what we do. One of my colleagues uses the term ethical reflection. This is really about thinking about what we are going to do and pausing to review each task to ensure that we have not strayed from our ethical responsibilities. Now, keep in mind that intentionality is an ethical obligation. It's important to proactively identify and to disclose any conflicts of interest that may exist. As they say, the best way to avoid the perception of impropriety is to avoid the perception of impropriety. Beware of all the shortcomings, right? In the objective, what seems like a good idea is not always a good idea. In the data, the solution may reflect biases in the data. The algorithm can make it even worse. In the algorithm, right? We need to be clear about the pros and cons of each technical and non-technical decision during the development. And this goes beyond the selection of the technique. And then in the use, right? What are the possible unintended uses? How do you prevent them? At the end of the day, we have to keep in mind that users are human and humans have many shortcomings. You have to document your decisions and the justifications for these decisions. How have you demonstrated all of the above? Now, an interesting idea is that you can, proactively monitor and correct biases and misinformation in what we do, as well as in our products. So it's kind of a, continuous improvement of ethics, if you would. We can even have a process for an ongoing validation of algorithms against bias, like we so often do with model performance against deterioration. So when we detect biases, there's work to be done to update or fix or whatever. And then finally, we have to take responsibilities for all of our actions and decisions. This is a professional ethical obligation. So, what are the questions that can kind of serve us, as a guide or checklist? So, I would take these as simply a starting point to guide our decisions and actions. The first is it legal or consistent with the spirit of the law? This is probably the most obvious one, right? Then, who does the information belong to? Is it moral? For whom? What are the risks? Who does it put at risk? Who does it benefit, either directly or indirectly? Who does it compromise, again, directly or indirectly? What are the possible consequences? And does it work as intended in all areas? And each of these questions have to be evaluated across different dimensions, like legal, regulatory, normative, moral, financial, reputational, physical, psychological, mental, emotional, and considering the direct versus indirect effects and all the other things. Then finally, how do you know that you have fulfilled your ethical obligations and how have you demonstrated it? I mean, how are you going to stand on your business here? So you probably now have more questions than before and maybe more questions than answers. But I hope this has kind of helped to open up the conversation about ethics and data and analytics. In the slides, there are references in the appendix that you will receive, and hopefully that will be of some use. And you'll see the links to the cases that are mentioned in the chat. So, with that said, I don't know questions, uh, answers. Anybody have answers? Or complaints, comments, etc. Please welcome them in the chat. Okay, there's a question. If somebody says if the customer wants it, it is as ethical. How do you respond? I think it's kind of goes back to, let me go back to the previous slides. Um, I think I kind of go back to these questions. Hopefully it's consistent with laws and regulations. What are the risks? Some of the things I'll just look at are like, what are the risks? Whom, and this specifically, right? Whom does it compromise? What are the possible consequences? And start to kind of answer these questions. Um, Now, the people in position of authority sometimes, tend to override things, and so this is kind of where you have to stand up on your own. You, as an ethical professional, have to stand up on your own to be an ethical professional. It's hard. A lot of times it's hard, but again, that's sort of where you have to stand on your business. Um, so that was one of the questions. Anyone else with any questions or comments? Yes, there was a comment about it being a helpful overview, and that was exactly what it was meant to be. It was meant to be nothing super deep, but it's an overview and just to open up our the way we think about ethics. Anyone else? I'm sure this is probably more confusing than anything else. Yes, a comment about the data security. I think data security is kind of an interesting one because it's something we know we have to do, and they make us do it, but then it's really just um, it's the way it gets implemented is really just preventing other people from doing stuff to us, right? But then the whole idea of this kind of the ethical thinking, thinking about ethics is to turn the question internally to us, right? There are people that there are things that others are going to do. What are we doing, right? What are we doing? What are you doing to prevent, to do better, et cetera, et cetera? The question is really about ourselves and not about other people. Um, and I think that's really the hardest part about ethics is that you can't ask you can't ask a questions all 100% about other people because at the end of the day, ethics is really going to kind of come back to you yourself and what decisions you make and what you do and how you sort of demonstrate that. So um, hopefully that's if nothing more than to sort of change that perspective a little bit about ethics, hopefully this was helpful. Anyone else? If not, thank you very much for your attention. If you and time, if you have any, sort of lingering questions, feel free to reach out to me. And if nothing else, thank you, and you guys have a great rest of the day.